So considering how radiation arrives from the sun and it comes through the atmosphere and it arrives at the surface, and then what happens to it? It's either absorbed by the surface and the surface heats up and we evaporate water and we keep things warm, or it's reflected. But what happens in the intermediate bit where there are plants? So we know that plants cover large fractions of the terrestrial land surface, and of course we depend almost entirely on plants. I'd go so far as to say entirely, pretty much, because even when we look at resources from the ocean, the food material that we take out of the ocean is dependent at the top, at the bottom of the food chain is also dependent on plants. So plants, phytoplankton in the ocean. So why and how has this arisen? This whole system that is so fundamentally based on capturing sunlight, and what is it? And of course that is photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process through which pigments in plants and animals to a certain extent, but plants, but the pigments, primarily chlorophyll, absorb radiation from sunlight. So these pigments have evolved to absorb that radiation and to turn it into something useful. So the process of photosynthesis underpins, if we think about where it goes and what happens to it, enables plants to capture energy and turn it into a useful thing. And what do I mean by useful? It enables them to take sunlight, carbon dioxide and water. So it's a very simple equation in one sense. You have carbon dioxide and water are the things that you need from the outside, so material. And what chlorophyll does is it's a chemical, very complex chemical process that allows you to use sunlight to break those carbon dioxide and water down and turn them into much more complex molecules, particularly sugars. So the sugars are then the things that you can use to drive biological energy processes that you can pass on to the tissue within plants that allows them to function. It allows them to move stuff around and particularly to build tissue. So those sugars are the food that allow the plants to grow bigger and produce mass. And it's that mass which obviously some of that mass is tissue that in plants, different types of plants, goes into different places. So woody plants produce woody material that has a lot of cellulose in it and lignin, and it produces an architecture that allows you to grow bigger and taller. Whereas if you're a sort of much smaller grassy or flowering plant, you have a much smaller structure that's mostly sort of cellulose. And those structures that are then grown contain that energy in some sense. It contains that energy in the tissues that are grown by those plants. Lucky for us, because then what happens is that there is a whole system of other life on Earth, particularly on the above the surface of the ocean, that is then dependent on that and can use it in some way. The plants very kindly have captured the sunlight and turned it into sugars and other more complex carbohydrates. And it's a lot easier for other organisms to come along and exploit the energy in those complex carbohydrates. So if you're then an insect or a mammal, you can come along, fishes in the ocean, you can come along and you can exploit that energy that has been captured by the plants. So the plants do all the hard work and then the animals come along and eat it. And that of course provides the basis for the food chains in the ocean and the food chains on land. So photosynthesis underpins all of that. And so you'd sort of think, okay, well, photosynthesis must be a very well understood process. And that's the really interesting thing, is that photosynthesis, which is such a fundamental part of life on Earth, and in fact, up until about 30 years ago, just as an aside, up until about 30 years ago, it was thought that essentially photosynthesis drove all life on Earth. And so I say nearly all life on Earth. That's not quite true, in that about 30 years ago, we discovered organisms on the bottom of the ocean living around what's called these black smokers, which are geothermal vents, which are spewing hot, very nutrient-rich water from deep in the geological strata into the bottom of the ocean. And these small islands of life were discovered that exist at very deep parts of the ocean that are somehow able to exploit things like silicon and phosphorus. So that's an amazing thing in itself, in that up until, as I say, 30 years ago, photosynthesis was the only route to life on Earth. Now there's been another window opened, and that is very interesting because up until then, if you were looking for life on other planets, your hypothesis would be that you have to find a way that essentially some form of photosynthesis-like mechanism has to have occurred. And then finding these organisms existing at the bottom of the ocean completely independent from sunlight meant that, it turns out, completely separate ecosystems can evolve entirely in the absence of sunlight. That means that, all bets are off as far as looking at life on other planets is concerned, because it can operate. It's evolved at least twice on Earth using completely different mechanisms. So if it's happened twice, who's to say it hasn't happened 20 times? We just don't know where to look. But going back to photosynthesis then, so of course there's been a lot of effort to try and understand photosynthesis from the perspective of the sort of purely scientific. How does it work? One question would be, well, because if you know how it works, then you can potentially model it and you can potentially exploit it. More generally though, it's actually a very, very complex process. So that was the thing that when scientists started looking at the photosynthetic process in the early part of the 20th century, right through till now, some major breakthroughs have occurred in our understanding of it, different parts of this process. But our full understanding of it is still a long way from complete. That, again, makes it a very interesting scientific question, but one that also then presents us with a difficulty, because thinking back to climate and the carbon cycle, the biogeochemical part of the carbon cycle in terms of plants, one of the key things that we need to think about is how we incorporate photosynthesis. Because if photosynthesis is the driver, the sunlight comes in and the photosynthetic apparatus of the plant is what turns that sunlight plus the carbon dioxide plus the water into useful material and then releases oxygen back into the atmosphere. That whole cycle needs to somehow be included in our models. And of course, this is where it gets complicated, because, as it always does, the answer is never simple, because this process happens at the individual leaf scale, and it happens within the individual cell scale within the leaves. Great. Unfortunately, we want to look at the whole of the Amazon or the entire tropics and understand what the carbon budget is from photosynthesis from that. And so that aim, and then understanding how this photosynthesis scales up to very large scales is a very challenging problem. There's lots of interesting things that have been found over the last few years. Again, the combination of new observations from satellites and from other kind of observation networks. That's one of the things where the sort of ecological community have really opened up this field by combining observations at lots of different scales. So one of the things that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years is these flux measurements, the CO2 flux measurements and networks of these things. So essentially what that is a tower that may be just a bit taller than the canopy. Some of them are taller than that, but a lot of them are just a bit taller than the forest canopy, so maybe 40 or 50 meters in the tropics or 30 meters in deciduous woodland. And on the top of that tower, you have an infrared gas analyzer that measures how much CO2 is passing in and out of a given little parcel of atmosphere at any one time. It also measures the vertical and horizontal wind speeds, so it tells you how wind is moving and how much carbon dioxide there is in this little piece of atmosphere that's going past. The reason why that's useful, really interesting, and has really opened our eyes is because what you're doing, if you're monitoring how carbon dioxide is passing and coming into and out of this canopy, and you monitor it over day and night, what you're seeing is the piece of vegetation, whether it's a crop or a forest or whatever, you're seeing it breathing. You're seeing the results of photosynthesis going on. And so what we see we look at these measurements. They are taken continuously over months and years, every 30 seconds. And what you capture is you capture the real dynamics of photosynthesis and the way the plants are carrying this out. So what you do is you see that the carbon dioxide levels are going down during the day as the plants start photosynthesizing. The sun comes up, photosynthesis starts, the plants start to really draw down carbon dioxide. They're maximally photosynthesizing during the middle of the day, assuming there are no constraints due to sunlight and rainfall and so on. And then by the evening, it drops off again, and at the night time, the photosynthesis stops. And so you see this daily pulse of up and down in carbon dioxide. And then you see this, if you have these towers, not just in one place, but across whole forests and across whole continents, you see this process of photosynthesis going on at scales of, a few meters, right up to very large scale. So our sort of understanding of photosynthesis needs to be done at these very different scales, and there are these new observations that we're making using, again, combining satellites, combining models, and these kind of gas flux measurements, which are giving us a perspective on the dynamics of photosynthesis and how it changes and how it will vary with temperature and rainfall all across the globe.